I'm excited to talk to you today about Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 15. So, the first part of the temple sermon, and how this is impact, like what we can gain from this today in our lives, and how this impacted the Judeans who were reading it. The first thing I want to talk about are first impressions of the text. So, when I first look at the text, the first thing I see, even though this is sort of more world of the text, but this repetition of temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord, temple of the Lord. Um, it jumps out when you see something repeated verbatim three different times. There's also a lot of discussion here of the temple, as there is in other texts, but very clearly it seems to be sort of wielded by God to tell the people that the temple is not going to keep you safe. Like the building is not what you need right now, rather than the people themselves being like, oh, it's okay. We don't need the building. We have God. We have the Sabbath. It's God saying, like, uh, it's not okay. And the temple was not ever going to keep you safe. So you need to get it together. There's also a very clear outline. God lays out, like, here are the things that you need to do. And they're things that God has said previously, other prophets, as well as in the Pentateuch. So it lays out sort of parts of the Ten Commandments as well. So it's a very clear outline of, like, these are the things you guys need to do. The phrase the den of robbers stands out to me because, of course, it's used in the Synoptic Gospels when Jesus is cleansing the temple of the money changers. And then when I first read this, like, I can't help but think, like, this is coming from a lot of trauma. And we're actually going to look at that when we look at the world behind the text, but I did want to bring it up as a first impression. So one other thing is that there's a lot of discussion of place. So there's let me dwell with you in this place. There's discussion of the temple, the land that I gave you, this house, my place that was in Shiloh, the house that was called by my name. Those are all from the NRSV translation. Um, and in the NRSV translation, there's lots of ifs. If you do this, then I will do that. If you do this, then I will do that. So it's really like almost feels like a negotiation, but maybe it's sort of a new framing of the covenant. And then there's also invoking the Torah, invoking the Pentateuch, coming up with the commandments and things that God has said before that are really important. And there's discussion of familial relationships. So it mentions ancestors twice and then kinsfolk at the end as well. I'm going to look at the world of the text. I'm looking at three words. Makom, the word for place, Nasal, the word for safe, and Gur, the word for that's translated in the NRSV as alien. So the first word, place, Makom, it's used in this passage in five places. So in verses 3, 6, 7, 12, and 14. It's also used just a lot in the Old Testament. It's used 388 times in the Old Testament. And within those times, it's translated as either place or places 337 of those times. So, like, the vast majority of those times, it's defined as place. The next highest sort of hit on the chart is when it's translated as home, but that's only 11 times. Um, so there's really, like, this is a word that the translators have decided means place. And turns out the authors of the lexicon agree with them. The Old Testament Word Study Dictionary says it is a common noun indicating a place, a spot, a space, a stand, a location, any place or location specified. Figuratively, the place of the wicked, also a place at a table for eating, a place to live, a spot where you're standing, a city, a place of a city, a spot on a person's body, a place for a statue, holy places, sanctuary, Jerusalem, the temple, also pagan holy spaces. So it really can be used for a lot of different things. Strong's also agrees. It calls it a spot, used for localities, used for conditions, used for home, open place, room, space. So this is a very broad sort of word. And what I like about that is that it shows how important context is in what we're reading. So when we look at this word, makom, for place, it's not telling us that it's a holy place. It's not telling us that it's a pagan place. It's not telling us that it's even a geographic place or a figurative place. So we really have to look at the words around it and kind of glean from that what this might mean and rely, of course, on various translations. And then the next word I want to look at is nasal or safe. And I see this in verse 10 in this passage. And then they come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe. So this is when the people are coming to God and they're saying, like, all right, we're inside the temple and we're safe. And God's like, but you're just going to keep doing abominations. What makes you think that you're safe? And so I wanted to know what the folks meant by we are safe. Like, are they safe from hell? Are they safe from the Babylonians? Like, what does it mean that they're safe from? So when I look at the definition, I first looked at BDB complete, and it says that the basic meaning in Hebrew is to extricate or to pull out, to take away or to snatch away should be assumed as the basic meaning. But then it also says that it indicates removal or liberation from all types of restrictions. And when I dig a little bit more into the Old Testament Word Study Dictionary, it also says that it means to deliver. So deliverance from the power of another. Um, uh, that God was delivering his people, and it's used, sort of throughout. It's used in Genesis, it's used in First Samuel, it's used in Second Samuel, it's used in the Psalms, Judges, Second Chronicles, Exodus, to talk about delivering God's people. And then uh, the TLOT goes into a lot of um, detail about what this particular word means. But it basically is the idea that Yahweh will free people from various types of distress, it says. But what I found really interesting about this particular entry is that it says, yeah, in all these contexts, this word never becomes a specifically theological term, neither can it be described as a technical term for the deliverance from Egypt, despite its uses in Exodus, Judges, and First Samuel. So it's interesting that it's not going to carry a theological meaning. And then the last word I want to look at is alien or ger. And I also looked at the Greek word for alien when I was doing a word study in New Testament. And it was interesting to find that there was actually a lot of overlap between how this was defined, or that particular word was defined in Greek, and how this is defined in Hebrew. And so what I found from BDB Complete is that this is a sojourner or a newcomer. It's used to talk about Abraham. It's used to talk about Moses. It's used to talk about hospitality. It says that you essentially have the same obligations, similar rights, similar privileges. Not exactly, but similar. And that there's not a ton of distinction made in obligation. The Old Testament Word Study Dictionary also says that this is anyone, who is not native to a given land or among a given people, and that this could be people who leave their homeland and go elsewhere because of war or danger. So it cites Moses and Naomi, as well as God's call to Abraham, and being an alien in the land of Canaan. Um, it it essentially says it doesn't matter how long they're going to be there, if their stay is temporary, but the idea is that they don't identify with the group with whom they're living. They're different people. um, and it's used over and over to talk about how people should be hospitable to sojourners or aliens. um, and so there are distinctions among them, like uh, aliens can eat unclean food. Um, Aliens don't necessarily have the same access to Passover unless they're going to follow certain um, uh, laws. And so, but it's not a derogatory term like we might hear in English. It's really someone who's just sort of a stranger in a strange land. Okay, so moving on. So I want to look at these two translations, because I usually look at NRSV and JPS. NRSV is what I'm used to, so seeing it in a different light and translated for a different audience is really helpful. But I haven't done a comparison between a translation of formal equivalence and a translation of dynamic equivalence yet. And I know we always say bad things about the Message Bible, but I'm actually not super familiar with it, so I'm not really familiar with much dynamic equivalence. It's been a long time since I pulled out my mom's NIV Bible, so I wanted to sort of see how these things would play against each other. So the first thing is like very first phrase that's used. In NRSV, it's the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Sort of a longer way to say what NET says, which is the Lord said to Jeremiah. So the subject in the first is the word, and the subject in the second is the Lord. The next difference was that what's translated as hosts in the NRSV is translated as heaven's armies, which sounds so different than hosts. Can we imagine using heaven's armies in our Eucharistic prayer? I think that would maybe throw a few people off. There's also the amend your ways and your doings and let me dwell with you in this place. So let me dwell with you. In NET, it's I will allow you to continue to live in this land. So there's a different sort of subject and object there happening. And next, there is a sequence where God is saying, if you don't do this, if you don't do that, if you don't do this, using the word if over and over in the NRSV. In the NET, it's you must do this, you must do that, you must stop doing this, you must stop doing that. It's much more forceful, just as it is when God says, here you are to the Judeans, and then the NET says, but just look at you, which has a real different connotation. Again, when going through these things that harken back to the Pentateuch and the commandments given there, the NRC frames it as a question. Are you going to do this? Are you going to continue to do that? And the NET is like, you do this, you do that, you lie, you sacrifice to Baal. Like much more accusatory. Like there's not a question here. It's I can't believe you're doing this stuff and expecting me to be cool with you. Last comparisons between the two translations. There's a portion of NET, which is the word hina, and it's translated in NET as you had better take note. And that's just completely removed from the NRSV. But again, it's very forceful against God's people. The next piece is go now to the place that was in Shiloh where I made my name dwell at first. But here it's not where I made, excuse me, in the NET, it's not where I made my name dwell at first. It's where I allowed myself to be worshiped. So it's sort of a very different connotation. And then finally, therefore I will do to the house that is called by my name in which you trust. So this house that's called by my name, passively called by my name. But in the NET, it's this temple that I have claimed as my own, this temple that you are trusting to protect you. So it's not just trust, it's trust for protection. And also, this is not just some temple that people call by God's name, it's the temple I have claimed as my own. Real behind the text, I honed in really on two journal articles that I found to be really helpful for understanding not just Jeremiah, honestly, but sort of all of the work of the prophets, really all kind of exilic and post-exilic literature. So this is Joshua Axton's Jeremiah's Temple Sermon as a Traumascape, reading Jeremiah 7:1 through 8:3 through the metaphor of the phantasmagoria. And that was in biblical interpretation. And then also Juliana Klassen's Preaching the Pentateuch, reading Jeremiah's sermons through the lens of cultural trauma. So I had mentioned at the beginning that I wanted to look at this more through a lens of cultural trauma. And when I read through these articles, I found some similar themes that I also found in the text as well, which is that this sermon serves as a container for memory, as a means of processing. There's a lot of continuity of the covenant that God has given to God's people. There's a lot of discussion of place. And it's used as a means of justification. So why is this happening to us? Well, let Jeremiah tell us through God. So in terms of the container for memory as a means of processing, Axton says that it reads the temple sermon as a literary traumascape. So it says that the point is to provide a literary site for the processing and containment of cultural trauma, thereby reinforcing the identity and solidarity of the reading community. So it's really about kind of what are we reading and how is this going to kind of calcify or coalesce our identity as a people. So even though it's traumatic and it's sort of accusatory, like this is really bringing the people together. So it's critical to look at who's reading this and what they are getting out of it. Axton's also talks about the politics of memory, so the processes of negotiation about whose conception of the past should prevail in the public realm. And he's quoting Karen Till there. And then Clausen's pulls in Kathleen O'Connor and Lewis Stolman, who we've obviously read in Lewis Stolman we've read in class. And says that they've compellingly argued how written prophecy serves the function of helping people cope in the aftermath of trauma. And so writing these things down and saying these are the things that were going to happen really helps people to process this. She also says that Stolman describes the function of prophetic literature as to reorder values, reconstruct meaning, and create new symbolic and social worlds in the aftermath of war and community dislocation. So they've been dislocated. It's traumatic. So this is what they're using as their container for how are we going to remember this and how are we going to make sense of this. Throughout the sermon, there's a continuity of the covenant. And Axton says that this really, it traverses the length of Judean cultural memory. And he says it exposes Judah as corrupt from its inception. So people are kind of pulling in the covenant and breaking the covenant as evidence that they have been corrupt, and maybe this is why all these things are happening to them. And then Jeremiah is continuing to remind them of the temple, the covenant, the Sabbath. Clausen says, by preaching on Judah's earlier traditions, the prophet reconstitutes these ancient customs in a new way in an attempt to rebuild the fractured community. So it's not just why has this stuff happened, it's also what do we do next. And then Clausen again notes that there is a summary of the 10 Commandments in Jeremiah 7:9. And then also, like Clausen says, that God is calling out injustice, the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed. And so in this way, by saying these are the people you need to take care of, when God is speaking to an oppressed people, they're hearing God wants to take care of us. So we need to take care of the marginalized. And in that way, when we are marginalized, we will be taken care of. As I said, there is a lot of emphasis on place. So Axons talks about geosymbols. So a place where like you're inscribing your whole identity onto a particular place. And then when that's destroyed, it's traumatic. So this is very much in line with the destruction of the temple. But then Axton says the reference to place in verse 3 implies a shift in the emphasis from the Deuteronomistic understanding. It is not the divine name that will dwell in the place, but the people themselves. So it's switching from what we've talked about in class as this name that is dwelling in a place, but it's the people who are going to dwell in the place. And then Clausen says, like, folks are kind of have this magical idea about like the temple making them invincible, and God is like, this is just not going to happen. And the temple is not, she says, the temple is no longer going to serve as your sanctuary, their sanctuary that would keep themselves safe from all harm if they continued to commit gross injustices. So like I said at the beginning, this is God wielding the temple and saying like, this is not going to keep you safe. You guys need to get it together. And then finally, like, this is not victim blaming, but what folks are doing here is they're trying to find a justification. So Clausen says they're both reaffirming the tradition and also challenging previous understandings of gods. And she also says that they're trying to bring order back into a chaotic world by finding a clear explanation for the fall of Jerusalem. So like, why did Jerusalem fall? Okay, maybe it's because of this bad stuff we did. And so the fact that they survived, despite everything they've done, Clausen says it means that God is still in control. So it's better for them to have some kind of explanation going on, so that they still have hope for redemption. Because if it's just total chaos, then there's no hope for redemption. And here God's given them a very clear outline of here's what you need to do. Clausen also talks about Stolman again and says, read though in terms of a process of cultural trauma, this notion of self-blame, according to Stolman, can be understood as a way of reframing traumatic events so as to help people make sense of what happened to And she also says that to survive, victims need interpretations, even bad ones, even false ones, even partial ones, even self-blaming ones. Okay. So then moving on to the world in front of the text. When I was reading this, particularly when I was reading those two articles, I was reminded of a something I'd studied in undergraduate in one of my African fiction classes, which was a project in Rwanda following the Rwandan genocide. That was it was writing out of duty to memory. So they brought writers from all over not all over Africa, but writers who are only from Africa to write in French. Um, some wrote nonfiction, and then I think about half also wrote fiction. Um, and it was interesting because the idea was that like we're going to use this writing to process what's going on. The I pulled this article from Audrey Small, who gave a much better overview of it than I certainly could from memory. One of the things she talks about is that, like, as with any literature, well, particularly sub-Saharan African literature, um, it's a largely oral society. That's problematic when you're writing a book. When you're writing it in French rather than native Rwandan language, when you're writing a book that has to be imported from France and it's expensive. So Rwandans are not necessarily going to be reading this. And I see parallels here, right? In Hebrew. So like we have these manuscripts, they're hard to get, like it's expensive to copy them. Um, and yet they get to people. There was also it was slightly problematic, some folks felt, to use fiction to treat this. And to me, there's a parallel there to sacred stories. Boubacar Boris Diop was quoted as saying that only fiction can treat the subject by engaging the power of human imagination to make a move towards understanding, something which bare facts cannot do. I also wanted to pull in a quote back from Clausens, who is writing, of course, about Jeremiah, that says, one should note that the narrative constructions emerging from a process of cultural trauma are open to misuse, both political as well as societal. So rewriting any memory can be problematic and has the potential for abuse. But the way that Audrey Small describes this is that what's critical here is the interaction, she says, between these essays and the literary text and their respective worth accorded to them by African readers in fulfillment of the wish for the project to be seen in terms of solidarity. And so that's a question which remains to be answered. This ultimately will be the key to whether the wish to solidarity can be seen as a success or not, the reactions of the readers. And for me, this is also similar to the work of the prophets. So the work of the prophets is solidarity insofar as it helps the people reading it. So there's kind of a reader response thing going on here where if it helps the Judeans to process, like that means it's in solidarity. That means it's prophetic. If it's helping us to process, that breed, brings solidarity. That brings a prophetic work to us. So I just wanted to pull in that there are ways of processing things. And I pulled the Rwandan genocide, but I'm also thinking of other genocides and other horrible things that have happened, ways that we can process them, ways that we can provide containers for memory, and ways that we can use the prophets' literature, the prophets' language, the prophets' sacred stories to help process our own trauma and grief. Thank you so much.